let's talk about the 5-foot bookshelf, 57 great books that every Christian should own. In the early 1900s, Harvard University president Charles W. Elliot made an offhand comment that a 3-foot bookshelf would be all that was needed for a motivated person to give themselves a fulfilling education. Well, predictably, he was inundated with requests for an exact list of books that would go on this shelf. And after more careful consideration, he found it necessary to expand his shelf to 5 feet to accommodate all his recommendations. And starting in 1909, his recommended books were published as a 50-volume set, now known as the Harvard Classics. In marketing materials for the set, Elliot wrote, "My aim was not to select the best 50 or best 100 books in the world, but to give, in 23,000 pages or thereabouts, a picture of the progress of the human race within historical times, so far as that progress can be depicted in books. My task was to provide the means of obtaining such knowledge of ancient and modern literature as seemed essential to the 20th century idea of a cultivated man. The best acquisition of a cultivated man is a liberal frame of mind or way of thinking, but there must be added to that possession acquaintance with the prodigious store of recorded discoveries, experiences, and reflections which humanity, in its intermittent and irregular progress from barbarism to civilization, has acquired and laid up." Well, as a book lover myself, I've always been interested in the idea of assembling a set of books that would give a Christian with limited shelf space and a limited budget a solid library from which they could deepen their knowledge of Scripture and theology. And so this 5-foot bookshelf is my attempt to provide such a list. Limiting myself to the same constraints of 5 feet of shelf space, I've curated books in the areas of biblical studies, theology, apologetics, church history, Christian living, personal devotion, and Christian literature. The goal is that this shelf would contain sufficient resources to study Scripture in depth, be guided in developing sound theological foundations, and increase your faith. I've also chosen books that you can return to again and again and still benefit from. As with Elliot's list, I do not claim that these are the only books that you should own or that you should read in each of these categories. Instead, these selections will provide the reader with a depth and breadth of knowledge within a limited amount of space and, as a result, can be obtained with a limited budget. As was the case with the original selection of the Harvard Classics, the contributions of living authors have been limited in favor of books about which, as Elliot said, the verdict of the educated world is more final. In any given category, there's going to be a great book that was left out in favor of another. You might prefer one author above another. There will be, in all likelihood, gaps in these recommendations that can be remedied by later revisions. I went through dozens of recommended reading lists and syllabi from seminary courses to narrow down 57 books in these different categories that really, if these were the only books that you had on your shelf, you would still be fully equipped to have a better understanding of Scripture, of theology, of developing your walk with Jesus and deepening your faith. As I go through this list, I keep a running tally of the space required for each book, and it's limited to 5 feet or 60 inches of books in total. You can see my attempt for creating a 5-foot bookshelf at reasonabletheology.org/bookshelf. And this is my attempt to provide sufficient amount of material to allow for a deep study of Scripture and doctrine, as well as devotion and spiritual development that can fit on a 5-foot shelf. And now it's likely, if not certain, that I've made selections that you disagree with, or that there are other books that you would recommend adding to the list, and I want to hear your suggestions. But here's the rule. You cannot go over the 5-foot restriction. If you recommend a book to add, you must also suggest which book or books of similar width that you would leave off the shelf. Again, you can leave your recommendations for what you would add, what you would remove in the comments at reasonabletheology.org/bookshelf. While you're there, you can also download a handy printable PDF copy of the list to aid you in building out your own personal library. So I hope you find that resource helpful, and please leave a comment with your thoughts on what you would add or perhaps take away from the shelf.